Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. I'm Hannah Shihabi, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. Throughout history, shaping and dominating narratives has been as strategic as achieving military gains in times of war. Today, the introduction of AI is accelerating the speed, scale, and sophistication of influence operations in ways that are becoming increasingly difficult to counter. This has been demonstrated in striking ways during the U.S. Israel-Iran war, where Lego battle scenes, memes, and AI generated content are blurring the lines between satire, propaganda, and reality. Today, slopaganda is reducing complex geopolitical dynamics into shareable, scrollable content. Take a look.
Here comes the heat from the USA. Boom! Pins down. What a strike.
For Iran, hear this clear. Your people reached out to us.
Yeah, we got the DMs here.
If one nation's gonna stand against the Epstein regime's fear, it's us till the last breath. We've been doing it for years.
They never obtained a nuclear weapon.
Why don't you explain this to me like I'm five?
No nukes, no Navy, and a complete dismantling of their missile program and defense industrial base.
Oh,
Sudan, Pakistan, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, Yemen. We're bringing you freedom, bro. They never asked for that. Retribution is coming where the storm you can't tame. Iran doesn't forget, and we're coming for the game.
This reality raises urgent questions. Who controls the narrative surrounding today's wars? What forms of content are proving most resonant? And what does this mean for how we understand information wars? To unpack these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by Valerie Wirtschafter, Fellow of the Foreign Policy and AI and Emerging Technology Initiative at the Brookings Institution, Mahsa Ali Mardani, Associate Director of Technology and Technology Threats and Opportunities at Witness, and Muhannad Saloom, Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Valerie, I want to start with you to unpack the evolution of information wars. So we know that states have long competed to shape public opinion during conflict, but the integration of AI in influence operations is marking a qualitative shift. What is fundamentally changing in terms of the scale, speed, and method?
You're absolutely right that information warfare, the use of propaganda, especially during conflict, both hot and cold, are really nothing new. Even just a couple years ago, right, I wrote about the Israel-Hamas conflict and the information ecosystem there. And there was a ton of chaos online, right? There were plenty of structural problems. Some of them are new, related to social media and the way people seek information. Some of them are kind of as old as time, right? Like a sort of during times of crisis, the idea that there is a dearth of supply of credible information and a high demand to understand what's going on, that's very old. And then, of course, we've had platforms pushing back or pulling back their content moderation practices. All these things are still present, but that was, a couple years ago. And the contested conflict content during that time was really just sort of mostly recycled images, decontextualized clips, video game footage. AI was around, it was known. ChatGPT had already launched, but it wasn't sort of front and center. Those same sort of structural problems, the things that were present then, are still here. But really, I think what has changed now is the economics and capability ceiling of AI has improved. It's not necessary still. We still see some of that recycled footage. We still see those old clips. But generative AI now has, I think, dramatically really lowered the cost and time to produce sophisticated, compelling content. And the tools are really, I think, far more accessible now than they were even just a few years ago. A couple things that we've seen, of course, is just like uh, really basic stuff, especially during covert campaigns when you're trying to kind of manufacture consensus, play against the algorithms, go viral. Just being able to get rid of those grammatical errors, make agenda setting much easier online. Uh, Traditional approaches using that video game footage, those old images, you were kind of constrained. There's a lot of shocking, awful imagery that exists already, but you were kind of constrained by what existed before or what you could edit in Photoshop, and you needed somebody with skill to do that well. But now you can really kind of just fabricate things out of thin air, really quite easily. Whatever your wish, is possible. I think this was clunkier than before, but the tools are now getting better and better, especially if the goal is more covert action. When it's the overt sort of slopaganda version, really you can kind of like dream it up and make it happen at this point. That involved previously animation, more talent to be able to actually put these things together. Now it's much easier and much better. In recent research that I did, looking just at the like X and community notes, contested conflict or content that referenced generative AI had reached its highest point ever. So this isn't just qualitative; it's also quantitative, and we're seeing and hearing about reports, especially state-linked operations. The overt stuff is well known. The sort of Lego videos and the like are very well known, but also more covert campaigns that point back to the Iranian regime. And so, Iran, of course, is no stranger to this space, but seems to really, I think, be deliberately investing in these tools in both types of campaigns. I think, primarily to compensate for the military disadvantage, for the fact that the American public is a bit more malleable in terms of their support for this type of conflict.
Thank you, Valerie. And can I ask you briefly to touch on the American side of this conversation? I think the AI generated content has, of course, become associated heavily with Iran aligned groups and the Iranian state. But we've also seen this AI generated content be deployed by the US. How has that looked like on that front? And how is it different from the kind of Iranian content?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar sort of, maybe it's not the same trying to exaggerate the destruction type of thing, or to sort of glorify, sort of what or make it seem like this is more of a costly conflict for Iran, which is sort of the way Iran has framed its usage is right. Like, look at all the damages we are inflicting on the U.S. and its allies. That's not necessarily the side of the coin. What we've seen here is more of like the kind of glorification of the operation, sort of the same ways that this administration has used AI in the past, really, and it's much more visible and much more clearly sort of AI generated than some of the more covert stuff. But really, kind of to try and foment this sort of rally around the flag aspect that typically happens during the start of a conflict, but we're not really seeing it right now, right? The public opinion hasn't really been moving in support of this intervention in the same way it has potentially at the start of others. And so that's really kind of been more of the objective there.
Thank you, Valerie. And Mahsa, I want to go to you. So Iran, of course, has a long history of navigating a restrictive information environment, and that has largely led to the development of alternative and a large alternative media ecosystem. But how is this integration of AI shaping the way these actors are adopting AI-generated content in the current war?
You touched on a really important point, which is the fact that we're dealing with a information ecosystem that has been heavily controlled for many decades. And so when we see this conflict play out, we're seeing it play out in an ecosystem of multiple layers of control from a very centralized media ecosystem, a very centralized kind of propaganda apparatuses across the Iranian state. And of course, we have the technical centralization. And so all of these layers are very important in terms of what we're seeing with the kind of propaganda narratives. And I think one of the most interesting and crucial points that points to both the kind of external perception of the narratives coming out of Iran and both the internal dynamics at play is that you have this conflict play out in the midst of a internet shutdown, and the primary aim of the fact that the state is choosing to restrict communications for its own population is really to control the narrative. During the June 2025 war, we did see a similar internet shutdown, and the government narrative in response was that they were protecting national infrastructure from cyber attacks. This time, the veil kind of has dropped, and they have explicitly said what they're doing in terms of controls is to ensure that there is one voice being projected from inside of Iran to the outside world, which is why international internet is generally restricted for the over 90 million population Iran has. And AI has been a very crucial element into this because You have a lot of different kind of contractors and government affiliated production companies. The AI Lego videos are produced by what is generally known to be kind of this Besiege media company, Explosive Media, and I'm happy to unpack that actor a little bit more, that have these viral AI Lego cartoons that have a lot of traction and popularity within the Western world. You also have the fact that you have a country of over 90 million Iranians. And the perception of the war within a population that large is not monolithic. It definitely is not cohesive with the one narrative coming from the state. There are many varied versions of what people think about the war, from people generally agreeing with the U.S. and Israel attacking Iran, people being against them attacking Iran, to complex feelings about how people feel about the regime, or they support the regime or don't support the regime. However, in the vacuum where you cannot have access to what is authentically happening or what Iranians are authentically feeling, you do have the void that obviously the one Iranian state narrative fills. Uh, and the AI Lego videos and all of the different kind of production coming from the official kind of state or unofficial state accounts for that. And then, of course, you have the void that's being filled with the other conflict actors. You do have a lot of propaganda coming from Israel, either officially from the Israeli state or unofficially from the Israeli state. And there have been moments where you see the traction of that AI content really filling the void of, not being able to access what Iranians are authentically feeling. And one example to kind of illustrate what I mean is that um, there was one kind of viral AI video of a very popular residential building in Iran, Ekbatan. There's thousands of people that live in the Ekbatan building complexes in Tehran. And there was a video that went viral of a projection of an Israeli flag on this building. Now, this went viral. Many people believed it was true. And eventually, I mean, it was verified and debunked by many legitimate sources that this was completely generated by AI. But why did people believe this? People believe this because there is a general vacuum of being able to authentically know what Iranians are thinking and feeling. And there are chances that there are people who, are sympathetic or are supporters of Israel and Iran, but we can't access this because of all the many different layers of censorship. And so you have AI come in and fill this void and be able to deceptively get traction in that way.
Thank you, Mesa. And I want to probe you a little bit more later in the discussion on how people have been able to adapt and respond to these restrictions. But Mohanad, I wanted to go to you. So we've touched so far on the asymmetrical nature of this conflict, right? This is an asymmetrical conflict, which makes it very difficult for Iran to achieve any kind of symmetry on the military side. But that has made information a lot more consequential for Iran. So is Iran seeking to dominate the information landscape, and how is it seeking to do that?
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I think I will be probably repeating some of the points by Valerie and Mahsa, but from probably a different angle. Iran is not trying to win the information war. It's not, and does not have the capacity, and it's not one of its strategic objectives. And I think also what Mahsa mentioned and Valerie as well, that Iran does, they inside Iran, they don't have the internet during the war. They didn't have it. I don't know if they do have it now, but I think during the war definitely they did not have access to the internet, which means that the information war and the usage of AI during that time was directed somewhere else. So if Iran is not trying to win the war, what they are trying to do, they are trying to survive it, just like what they have been doing during the military campaign. And the logic, when you can't impose costs in the military field kinetically, you impose them cognitively. And it is the audiences are are different, and this is the same. This is not new, by the way, and also it's the same logic that Iran has been conducting the war in the tangible and the real world, which is basically, it's asymmetric approach to conducting this war. Now, I think why I mentioned that I might also come across the same points that Valerie at the beginning rightly pointed to, which is basically the scale in the past, and so where AI fits and where AI helps the Iranian regime conduct this information war. In the past, you would need probably a massive department to conduct such an operation. But now the scale is easily conducted through AI tools. And the second thing is the speed. It used to take weeks or at least a week or days if you have a bigger team. Now you can do that with a few prompts. And then the cost also obviously is very minimal compared to before. Not only how many people you need, but also the type of people you need, and also the targeting. In the past, the gaming, if you like, the algorithms used to be, and I mean in the very recent past, not in the not many years back. It used to be a bit harder. Now the Iranian regime has learned over the years how to game or play with the algorithms so that they not only use AI for producing the materials, for their information targeting, but also they can make sure that it goes to the right population. And during this war, we can see that Iran also did not, as I mentioned earlier, that did not focus on the people of Iran only, but also it focused on the regional, if you like, audiences in the Arab world. And I would say that it has been very successful. What I mean also in the region, because Iran has, if you like, supporters and also people who are against Iran, especially here in the GCC because of the Iranian regime targeting of GCC countries. But also, Iran wanted to make sure that it's the population within the scope of the axis of resistance would be supported, and supported through using AI and through producing this kind of material. And my assessment and my understanding that Iran has been also quite successful. So I think the framing is very important, that Iran is not trying to win, Iran is trying to survive, and they have done a very good job there. And if we understand it from that point of view, I think Iran discovered now during this war, the hard way, but they did discover that using information in the battlefield with the assistance of AI is strategically beneficial, but also it worked in tandem with what the politicians have been saying. So if we look at what, for example, Qalibov and Arakchi and others have been saying, you can see some, if you like, indications that there is an information, I wouldn't say warfare, but there is an information campaign that is being coordinated among all these elements with the assistance of AI. It's not always AI, but AI is part of the, if you like, it's part of the game. And this is, I think, the overall image that I can see from where I stand.
Thank you, Mohanad. And just to probe you a little bit more on a point you mentioned earlier. So you said it's not Iran's objective to win the information war. They've long realized that. But has the scalability of information using AI, the ability to produce content rapidly, react to different events that take place, the ability to scale this information at unprecedented rates, has it shifted their strategy in that sense? Has it heightened the importance of information in Iran's strategic calculus?
I think it has already been doing that for a while now. Iran understood the importance of the cyberspace, the importance of the information spheres that are available to the Iranian regime. And I think Iran is one of the few countries, if you like, in the region, with the exception of Israel, that has been focusing on this domain as much as using the conventional and focusing on the conventional military capabilities, because they understood there are limitations to what a country like Iran can achieve in terms of military capabilities. And this has been tested last June during the 12-day war, and it has been tested during this recent war. I don't know if we can call it ended, but it's still there is no deal. But the latest war, on Iran understood that they cannot really, for example, have an air force. They cannot have many of the conventional and traditional capabilities. But with the information, with the cyber domain, they understood that they could do much more, and it has been effective. And this, not only the scale in Iran, what, I haven't done a study on this, but I have been watching what the Iranian regime has been doing in the information sphere. And they have been very successful in targeting, especially Western audiences. And they know who to target. For example, the US has a massive information sphere. And so where they were target or directing their messaging was to the MAGA population that is usually supportive of President Trump. They went to the points that they wanted to dismantle the narrative of the Trump administration, targeting the weak points in these narratives, using what the war has exposed and the limitations of the US capabilities in the region. And it is very consistent right across the board what the Iranians have been doing and the capacity and capabilities that they have. They used it very well, and it is, as I said, part of their strategy to survive, because they think that their strategy of survival is their strategy of winning. They know that they're no match to the US in the military campaign or domain, and also they are no match to the US in terms of the information domain. The US, after all, has so many tools, and they didn't even have to use AI as much as the Iranians, because they're doing much better in the conventional military battlefield.
Thank you, Muhannad. And building on those points, Masa, I want to go to you and discuss the content that's coming out of these videos, right? So they've managed to achieve mass appeal because of the invocations to popular culture, Legos, Minions, and other references to popular culture and things that kind of speak to global and regional audiences as well. So I wanted to ask you about this kind of content. It's generating broader reach and appeal, but what about it makes it resonate so much? And what does its production reveal about the strategic intent behind this content? You mentioned earlier explosive media, and I think that's, of course, become a very prominent case or a very prominent group in the production and circulation of the kind of content that's established such wide reach. Maybe if you can touch on explosive media as well and their specific case.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really great question. And I mean, before getting into the content analysis, I do, just to touch on just the unprecedented scale of this conflict and what it just generally means for other conflicts, and how I think other bad actors are probably taking a lot of lessons from here, in terms of, uh, maybe Iran hasn't necessarily won the war or won the conflict in the traditional sense, but I think there have been significant inroads and progress in how AI war propaganda will go on following this conflict. And I do also want to hat tip to the really great research that Valerie did for Brookings, kind of trying to assess the scale and quantity of the content by assessing community notes off of X, trying to give us a glimpse into a very hard to define scale and quantity of what we've seen with AI content. But towards the question of exactly what the strategy of the content and the narrative is from Iran, I think it's really crucial to really understand the ideology and foundation at the core of the Islamic Republic. And this goes to even before the internet was introduced, which was when the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979. The kind of establishment and ideology behind the revolution was one that showed the regime as the representatives of the oppressed. And this is very much written within the Iranian constitution. And the crux of the ideology that permeates throughout state institutions and even the education system is Iran as this representative of the oppressed, of the global south, against, the big imperialist powers of the US and Israel. And so, very much the narrative, ideological, and propaganda foundations for this war were set in place for decades before it started. And in fact, you can say in many ways, the Islamic Republic had been waiting and craving for a chance to really mobilize this narrative. And so, when you do have a situation where you actually do have war crimes happening at the hands of these states, you do have civilian casualties. It basically has given the Iranian regime the most raw material it has ever craved, right? And so, um, one of the things that, as someone who is, a human rights advocate and has dedicated their life to the documentation of human rights abuses and accountability and justice, one of the kind of greatest harms that we see here is how evidence and documentation is being so undervalued by these propaganda efforts and by AI doubt in general. So you do have these situations where you have the regime, obviously, the authorities. Are over investing in documentation. They ensure that photojournalists go to the sites of civilian bombings in ways that a few months prior, during, for example, the very harrowing protest massacres that happened, where you had victims created at the hands of the authorities made sure through so many different layers of censorship, technical, physical coercion, that the documentation of those crimes wouldn't occur. And now during the war, you have a situation where they're over documenting and over investing. And so we've seen, because of this kind of atmosphere of AI, we've seen accusations of real documentation of civilian casualties be accused of AI. I've documented many instances of this where, for example, the very horrific bombing of the Minob school, which has been proven to have been done by the US. This was systematically denied by people with good and bad intentions online and accused of being AI. The photos of the funeral, for example, were accused of being AI generated content. And so you have the situation where real evidence does get mobilized for propaganda, which doesn't mean that it's not real. And you do have, the state also trying to further increase the impact of its propaganda by also using AI in the midst of it. For example, for the Minob school bombing, many different Islamic Republic state accounts were not only sharing real photos from the Minob tragedy, but they were also sharing, an AI generated backpack of a child with blood on it that was very easily found out to have been generated by Google's Gemini, for example. And so this different kind of layering between the distrust, between the presence of actually generative content, has created this just general sense of uncertainty and ambiguity. And I know that wasn't necessarily your question, but I think this is a very important layer of how we have this ecosystem, this very toxic information ecosystem that has been contributed to by, the information systems that the Islamic Republic has created, by the fact that you have an opposition to this regime, that you have all these different conflict actors. And so you have this general sense of uncertainty about what is real and what is not real. And of course, the regime at its core takes advantage of this. And we've seen the different ways they take advantage of this. I mean, the most kind of popular and viral example was a couple weeks ago when Donald Trump posted, in the midst of the ceasefire negotiations, he posted photos of 8 women that in reality was heavily kind of edited and filtered with AI enhancement and AI editing software. He shared those images, which were of 8 real women, with a piece of disinformation that they were about to be imminently executed. And so this went viral. It was spotted to have been a piece of content generated with AI next to a piece of information that was generally misinformation. And suddenly the Iranian regime latches onto this to generally undermine any of the discourse and documentation of the real abuses they commit. The Iranian judiciary immediately reacted that this was fake news, when at the heart of the matter, you had 8 real women protesters who were arrested in January. They were not all about to be imminently executed. One of them faces execution. The timeline of it is not known. But generally, they lashed onto this to propagate this narrative that any kind of accusation of the repression that goes on internally in Iran is part of this war narrative. And so this has been very harmful. It has been part of the, narratives that the regime puts out, like the AI Lego videos very much centers, the corruption and the ills of the Trump administration, what's been going on with the Epstein files, while completely trying to erase and call the accusations against its own bad behavior as fake news, AI generated, etc.
Thank you, Mahsa. And I just wanted you to touch very briefly on the entertainment side of all of this. There is, of course, a weaponization of the information available and created by the various conflicting parties, but there seems to be a heavy incorporation and reliance on an entertainment element here to establish that appeal. Could you briefly touch on that?
Well, like I said, the authorities in Iran have spent 4 decades really harnessing propaganda, their narratives, and their preoccupation with Israel and the US as, these kind of narrative and ideological pillars of like why they exist to stand in resistance to these big, imperialist powers has meant that they have spent many years studying this space. They know American pop culture very well. And there's actually a really great book written by an academic named Narges Bajogli called Iran Reframed. It's an anthropological study of how she's embedded herself with, the new generation of Basij media creators who are setting the new kind of propaganda and ideological communications policies that are supposed to come with the new generation of those of the elite of the Islamic Republic. And what's really interesting is that those kind of new generation Basij media creators are very much who are behind some of these new projects and these new narratives. Like explosive media is, I think in a very evidence way connected to that new generation of the Basij media creators. In fact, Nargis wrote a follow-up to her research um, in New York Magazine, saying that the Basij media creators that she had embedded with during her research in Iran, um, the very popular AI Lego media production teams are an outgrowth of that. And there's been different forms of documentation to show that they are very much connected to the state. I know there's been different interviews where Explosive Media, its founder says that they're independent. But if you study how Iranian propaganda and projects of Iranian influence campaigns and propaganda work, they're often like contracted to private companies, but these private companies are very much part of the apparatuses of the state, as in they were part of the Basij, youth groups that were trained in media production that now have their own kind of private companies that are creating this kind of content.
Thank you so much, Mahsa. And Valerie, I want to go back to you on the algorithmic level, right? That's been mentioned a couple of times now. But what's really happening on the algorithmic level here? And is the use of this recognizable entertainment adjacent information providing structural advantages for how this content is distributed and amplified across various platforms?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, I'd say there are kind of two compounding issues here, and they've been one is just at the core of social media platforms, right? By definition, algorithms are optimizing for attention. They're optimizing for engagement. Their goal is to sell you ads and keep you visiting and keep you scrolling. They're not necessarily optimizing for accuracy. That gets slapped on at the end, hopefully, and has sort of become less prominent across these platforms as well, particularly due to some political pressures recently. So that means that the most shocking things, the things that sort of cater to, base human psychology around, survival or fear or things like that, the most emotionally resonant content, that sort of information is what filters to the top naturally based on just the idea that we want to kind of keep you here and keep you looking. And in this context will go viral, whether it's AI or not. Of course, the AI component, and I mentioned, and Masa sort of mentioned this as well around the entertainment side. That's funny. It keeps people watching. Entertaining things are, part of this attention-seeking economy, the goal to kind of keep you there. And I think that this gets compounded by a newer element of platforms, which is monetization structures. Again, the way that users uh, join these monetization structures, they incentivize virality, which means they're incentivizing participation in this algorithmic curation. To go viral, you need engagement. You need to be able to kind of keep people on your page. And what does that is, again, the shocking information. And so people are now, have a profit incentive in some sense to share this type of content, whether it's true or not. And in the first few weeks, we saw this. We've seen this. I think Masa had a great report as well. Hat tip to your research too, about the sort of actually using investigations, debunking OSINT research as a way to kind of filter to the top of these conversations as well. People who wanted that supply of information when it was weak, who wanted more content, more ability to kind of uncover what is true, this sort of idea. Those people were kind of fabricating OSINT research type of content to enter into this viral conversation. The platform X especially pushed back a little bit, especially around AI specific content. But it's pretty easy to get rid of some of the ways that they detect AI content in terms of like watermarking and the like. So it's these two kind of compounding features that, especially in normal times, are not ideal for a healthy information ecosystem, but especially when we're in this moment where there's the supply and demand issue, they become kind of a toxic combination. And so we see the sort of more viral content that sort of secondary is accuracy, but entertainment and attention are really the primary focuses. That's what breaks to the top as a result of this structure, and really, I think makes it really hard to, especially in times of content conflict where information is scarce, to really find out what is true in any given moment.
Thank you, Valerie. And Mohanad, to push that a little further, I wanted to ask you about the regulation of this content, right? So we have a profit incentive here that's at play. And of course, the fact that this content is able to generate so many clicks and consistent reach and attention does, of course, drive the content algorithmically. But then because this content is able to circulate so quickly and seemingly with little restrictions, it raises questions about the regulations that are in place or the potential regulatory mechanisms that can curb their circulation, especially because we've seen mechanisms like shadow banning be used in other contexts to limit the spread of information. How are these dynamics playing out now? And what are the kind of mechanisms that can be deployed to limit, or are they being deployed to limit the circulation of this content?
Great. Well, I think this is one of the biggest challenges facing not only big countries like the U.S. and Europe and the U.K., but also here in the Middle East, especially where the existing governance, if you like, frameworks are not there, especially not up to par with the AI content and how fast it's being deployed. In the U.S., I think the biggest challenge now is how can we control, I mean, maybe for the lack of better word, this, the distribution of these materials, especially AI generated ones, during the time of war, without compromising the existing democratic frameworks and freedom and the freedoms of, if you like, of expression. For Iran, they're taking advantage of the Iranian regime, but also in other countries, they're taking advantage of these gray spaces. And also, there is, I think, a fundamental weakness in how countries, whether they are like in the West, like the U.S. or Europe or the U.K., or even I don't know if I mean the Chinese, they are trying to go there, but they're not there yet. So what we're looking at here, the fundamental problem is that these countries, they're still trying to retrofit the existing frameworks of regulation into this age and time of AI. There are very good ideas, especially in Europe, in how to deal with this, but I don't think they are effective yet. And the tests that they were tested the hard way during the war in Ukraine and the Russian propaganda. and also the what happened during this war and before. We could see that. I think I would take an example that I came across in the last 2 3 days, when the prime minister of Italy was complaining online that one of her pictures was used and abused by some kind of AI apps, and being circulated inside Italy in such a way that people believe that these pictures are true. And I imagine that this is the one of the most powerful, politically at least, most powerful figures in Italy, complaining that there is no way for her and her government to stop this. I mean, she had to go out herself and talk about it and post that picture, saying that this is where we are and this is the state in which Europe is. Obviously, Italy is part of that structure, and so when it comes to countries like Iran and what they're trying to do and how they are using and abusing AI in the current war and in the previous war leading up to this, I don't think that countries in the region and countries such as the U.S. is doing enough. And it goes both ways. If there is shadow banning and if there are other mechanisms in place by big tech companies, there is this tension between whether allowing or giving the freedom to these sources to create and distribute this kind of material, or restrict them and also risking losing a percentage of popularity of these platforms. We all remember also the platform X, what it used to be before Elon Musk, and what Elon Musk promised and delivered. And in both cases, there are, if you like, negative and both positive sides. One of the things that during when Elon Musk took over X, it was banning the president himself of the United States, accusing him of spreading lies. And now, with the advent of AI, and President Trump himself has used AI tools to produce content and distribute content online. And also, he used other types of information targeting adversaries, if you like, political adversaries, not only inside the US, but also notably when he retweeted or reposted a video of the current Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer, making, trying to target him politically. So what we are looking at here is basically too many countries are trying to control an information space that is global, that is controlled by corporations, and the tension between these two governments, governance, and control mechanisms on one side, and on the other side, you have commercial corporates. They are trying to monetize this, make more money, and pretending to be, or at least adhering to the minimum of regulation imposed by governments. But they also have their tools to punish these governments. And the Elon Musk and others, and I'm not picking on Elon Musk, but there are also other companies like Amazon and others. Sometimes they do punish these governments by relocating to other either states inside the US or other states, other countries. So the existing mechanisms, I don't see them. They are, matching the speed, if you like. They're always playing catching up, and they're not doing very well there in terms of regulating the information sphere, and especially it is stark here in this part of the world, in the Middle East.
Thank you, Mohammed. And Valerie, back to you a little on this tension and the pressure governments are under to counter these AI-generated influence operations. What are the tools available? Detection, labeling, takedowns, and where are they most effective and least effective in an active conflict environment? And maybe also a little on what can be done or should be done on states' part, but then also the corporations themselves and what they can do or what they are doing to try and limit the spread of this content.
I will try and get all those things, but if I forget something, you can re-jog my memory. But honestly, the toolkit is sort of limited in some sense, but it's mostly by implementation gaps. Um, on detection, we know that there are possibilities. They are of varying quality, but the research into detection has not matched the speed of sort of deployment and creation of more frontier capabilities. So while I think that detection is useful, it is hard to incorporate into, especially an online ecosystem where where content moderation is seen as a negative. And so crowdsourcing becomes kind of the more permissible version. And I think there's a lot of good things about content moderation, but the level of skepticism required to deploy some of these detectors is missing in that regard. And so it's really hard to kind of find that appropriate balance where expertise is especially necessary to be able to discern what is sort of a useful assessment. And then in addition, kind of pushing the frontier of these capabilities is really, I think, something that's lacking as well. Uh, labeling, labeling has been, I would say, one of my preferred methods because you get into, especially in the U.S., some of the politicized discussions around free speech, content moderation broadly. Just broadly providing more context, I think, is really valuable for people. The challenge is that people have to, especially on the AI case, have to be able to actually figure out that something is AI or not. And that involves important investments in detection capabilities, which again is compounded when the main crowdsourcing or the main labeling practice becomes a crowdsourced approach. In some of the research I did on this current conflict, X has leaned into this crowdsourced approach. AI references have climbed sharply, especially in the aftermath of this conflict, but really a little bit before as well. And so, what has to happen is that people debate back and forth what is and isn't a useful addition or a useful label to add as additional context. And so that becomes the next layer on this. And those have declined as AI content has spiked. Some of that is that they run it through a detector. Some of that is that the AI images are watermarked. Um, those things, as I said before, are kind of far easier to strip. So thinking about whether labeling is the appropriate approach, provenance for accurate content is another aspect of this that sort of gained a lot of traction in the lead up to a bunch of elections in 2024, has sort of quietly become less discussed. And so there's a lot of potential tools, a lot of potential conversations. They don't necessarily interact well together. The expertise required of crowdsourced moderation maybe doesn't gel with the requirements and sort of skepticism needed to bring toward AI detection. AI detection hasn't, is easy to remove in a lot of cases. Authentication for true content, accurate images is another avenue that's maybe something that hasn't been as explored as much in recent times. So the tools there are things that are possible, but they're not really operating at the moment at the speed and scale that is demanded, especially when a crisis hits, when you need to really surge content moderators or attention to a specific area. It's becoming increasingly hard because of the way that all these different pieces are interacting or not interacting effectively. And then on the company level, I mean, we have sort of two layers here now. We have social platforms, the X's, the Metas, the YouTubes, but those are. Then we also have frontier labs, right? We have OpenAI, we have Anthropic, we have Google, which owns YouTube, we have Meta, which does have Instagram and Facebook, and so there's some overlap as well. And so AI frontier labs are really kind of beginning to think through ways to detect generation, the sort of behavior of actually creating this type of content. And they've put out, some less frequent than others in differing levels of detail. With different criteria. There's not really harmonization across the industry about what these should look like, but they're starting to put out information, sort of modeling what social platforms did previously about how state and non-state actors are using their platforms for influence operations to develop this type of AI generated content. But not everyone is using open AIs. models. Not everyone is using Anthropic models. So, there's tons of open source capabilities as well. You can fine tune a model with a bunch of images. It doesn't have to be a large language model or a frontier model, right? It could be a smaller, more tailored model as well that's developed in house. And so, that's useful in some regard just to see how countries and non-state actors are using these tools for campaigns like this, but it's not the full picture either. And so, it's sort of like a mesh sieve layered on top of each other, and lots of things are getting through right now because they're not coordinated at all. They're never going to be able to fully cover this space, but more coordination, I think, could do a lot more with some of the tools that we currently have in place.
Thank you, Valerie. And very briefly, it's a little early on to say that there were lessons learned from this ongoing war, but are you noticing any changes? Are you observing any changes or adaptations to this evolving information landscape and the kind of responses that have been deployed?
I think that there has been a lot of some, but it's been more kind of crisis moment, right? Like I mentioned, X stop monetizing for AI generated content. Again, that's really challenging. Does that stand? How do companies sort of look back on this and say, okay, this was a crisis moment and we failed. What are we going to do for the next one? I'm not optimistic. I think companies sort of run from fire to fire a little bit, and some of that is capacity, and I totally understand that. Some of that is political pressure. There are a lot of competing forces in the space, given how fraught content moderation is right now in the US. But I'm not totally optimistic that lessons will be gleaned and put in place for the next crisis moment that inevitably evolves, where AI is, an increasingly important actor. I think the U.S. government as well. There were some systems in place to be able to at least push back on the narrative here, and be able to kind of counter it a bit more rapidly. I think this administration has dismantled some of those capabilities, and is sitting here being like, wait, like I wish we had a strategy in place to be able to push back on this. Again, this is not going to, the administration has top secret information. They know when these types of things putting in place policies or practices ahead of time is really important to be able to kind of avoid this confusion, to make sure that sort of the supply and demand dynamics are not so overwhelmed by whether it's opportunists trying to make a profit through some of these monetization efforts, or foreign actors trying to sway U.S. publics in one way or another with Lego movies or whatever versions of it. So none of this is. We know that there will be another crisis at some point, unfortunately, but the sort of foresight to put in place practices, it is lacking at the moment, and hopefully will be a lesson that can kind of be gleaned from this. But I'm not totally optimistic.
Thank you so much, Valerie. And Massa, I want to go back to you. So you've spoken about the difficulties of documenting human rights abuses in an information landscape that's dominated by this AI-generated content. But how do people who are, whether it's documenting human rights abuses, activists, journalists, communities on the ground, how are they navigating this space, and how are they bypassing these challenges?
Yeah, I think it's very unfair to say that the onus should be on regular people. There needs to be structural changes within the information ecosystem, and Valerie did a really great job of unpacking what we need from the company and platform level, because that is really what we need. And, our information ecosystem is increasingly being shaped by very powerful tech companies, already mentioned. But in terms of relying on things like AI detection. Valerie just mentioned the X monetization policy. This relies on post hoc AI detection, which we've already said is very unreliable. The technology to generate content is far more advanced than the technology to detect content. And so, and my team at Witness, we've done a lot of research analyzing this. We have a deepfake rapid response force that is a service for civil society, but we also do research based on the work we do with the AI detection and AI forensics companies. And so our emphasis really is that if we are asking for things from the tech companies, it needs to start very early on in the information pipeline. It needs to start at the model stage when content is being created. And so our team has invested heavily in the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, C2PA, which is developing content credentials. And in its kind of best form, these content credentials need to be applied in an interoperable way across all platforms to be able to, as I think Valerie alluded to, provide a kind of recipe for how a piece of content is developed, because we have a lot of complexity as well. It's not just AI generated content. We have real content that's, AI enhanced or AI edited right now. And there's generally a lot of confusion about that. And so there needs to be investments in all of these different trust signals, from things like content provenance that starts very early on in the pipeline. This is kind of being worked on through different legislations we see emerging. California's AI Transparency Act will be enforced over the summer. So we will see potentially how these content provenance standards will be required from some of these platforms. But generally, again, not to repeat Valerie, there isn't a lot of investment and resources being put by these companies, even within the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity that platforms like Meta are signed onto. We do not really see them committed or doing the work on this. And there's been really great research from like Indicator that shows AI labels do not work on Meta platforms. And I mean, we're expected to hear Meta's reaction to the oversight board recommendations on AI and conflict, uh, maybe this week or next week, to see if there actually will be some accountability or responsibility on their end for this area. With X, we're not really sure how they're doing AI detection for that. On paper, very good monetization policy, but how is this in practice? We have no transparency or insight into it. So while we're kind of seeing platforms renege on their responsibilities in this realm, I think we should also be looking to some how regulation is developing in, rights respecting and accountable ways for these tech companies that are really shaping our information ecosystem. So I will leave it there in terms of our kind of multifold levels of methods that we need to tackle these problems.
Thank you, Mahsa. And Muhanna, there is a very apparent scaling issue. We are not able to scale the resources that are needed to adapt to this information landscape. But what does that mean, right? What does it mean for accountability, political legitimacy, and the trajectory of not only this war, but future conflicts at large?
Great. Maybe I will talk about 3 points. Something that related to governance. The institutional architecture for information governance was built. I mean, the current one that we have was built for an era of expensive production and centralized distribution. Both assumptions are there today, if you like, retrofitting the existing frameworks is like applying maritime laws to space. So we need to rethink how the existing governance framework and how they could control the information sphere. The other thing is, and I think this goes in line with which has been mentioned, the economics today, because we talk about AI product, not only AI, information in general, information production is much cheaper today, much faster today. And the economics are, if you like, they lean more to the offensive side of things. So if a country or a group wants to produce any kind of information influence or even information warfare, they could do that because it's cheaper, much cheaper today. But the cost of countering that is still very high. So that is, the mechanisms that are today in a production, if you like, and they are existent today, and they have been probably recommended by people in the tech industry, in the governance, and the human rights industry. They're very valid, but the cost is still high compared to the production one. And maybe, and this is an area where I did some research into, where the Middle East and the usage of AI. The Middle East is not on the margins of this process. While the Middle East is not a center of production, it is a testing bed, and we can see this during the war in Gaza. We could see how Israel used AI in different ways, for not only in terms of automating the weaponry, but also of collecting data, of analyzing data so quickly, and also in targeting populations. All of this, I think, it has to be taken into consideration when it comes to bringing solutions. And I think also other countries, while they look at what is happening in the Middle East as far away, they are also learning a lot of messages. And this comes to the current war with Iran. I think many other countries are looking at what Iran has been doing. They're trying to learn from what Iran has done so far, and also they're looking at what the U.S. and Israel have done so far. And so, if we take these, into consideration, alongside what has been mentioned in terms of the technology available today to detect and regulate and govern the usage of information and AI, alongside the implications of the current war and the previous war, because the current war is a continuation of what has happened on the 7th of October 2023. I think there's so many lessons to be learned, and also we have to be modest about where we can start. These big tech companies are offering solutions that address their own concerns in terms of monetization, in terms of detecting, if you like, people trying to sell products and sell their own, I don't know, say YouTube or on X, on others are trying to make money. So these companies are trying to make sure that these people are not abusing AI for these very contexts. But what about other issues related to war information, and the saturation of if you like, cognitive war? So what Iranians have been doing in terms of losing the kinetic side, but they're saturating the information sphere with a lot of information, trying to change the cognitive perception of what is really happening on the ground.
Thank you so much, Mohanad. And with that, I want to go to you all for a final concluding question. In 1 minute, what's the single thing that worries you most about how this AI-generated information warfare is shaping the future of conflict? And I'll start with Valerie.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think this is sort of proof of concept as to how this can be used as both covert and overt approaches. And, I'll add, a lot of this we've been talking about, especially AI in the war context and AI detection and all of these things. Not all the usage of AI at all is bad. In fact, sometimes it's designed to just show AI, like be an AI image and kind of have that aesthetic. It's really where it becomes kind of like the covert design to deceive that is really, I'd say, quite challenging. And we've seen that be quite effective both on the covert and overt side. The ways that Iran has used AI to sow confusion about battlefield developments, and really, I think, effectively, and this was said earlier as well, kind of shorten the duration of this conflict, kind of survive it, really to kind of do that by leaning on U.S. domestic political fault lines, especially in a time where the U.S. population put the Trump administration in power because they were promised an end to forever wars. And so, I think what we've seen here is a real collision of domestic promises, the online space, and Iran really finding a viable wedge issue, and using a technology in a way that is kind of a template for other actors that they will likely be studying moving forward. And so, I think it is a clear reminder as well that moderation does have a purpose online, right? Like those sort of layers of detection and capabilities across the stack are not effective on their own. They need to be working in concert. And so figuring out a way to do that better, I think is extremely important. And then, the US has struggled to push back against this type of content. It's gaining traction both on the MAGA movement, but also on the left. And so, figuring out this sort of preemptive approach, making sure that the communication narrative element of it is aligned so that people can have accurate content and accurate information when they're most demanding it is, I think, fundamental to the future of any sort of conflict movement moving forward, especially in that acute period where supply is really, really low.
Thank you, Valerie. And Muhannad?
Well, I think the asymmetry is very striking. Have a look at what Iran did. It's by design that they actually blocked internet inside Iran, and they went on an offensive information warfare against the U.S. because they could do that. Well, and they know that the U.S. cannot do that back home. They cannot shut off the internet to block what the Iranians are doing. So the asymmetry also affects what we have been talking about in terms of governance and controlling, or at least making sure. I think Mahsa now has left, but Mahsa mentioned at some point that in Iran, one of the big challenges is for the Iranian people to verify whether this is AI created content or not. And for the US, probably the tools are available, but not as much as well. That's another challenge. But at least they do have access to different, if you like, venues if somebody wants to bother and take the time to verify. While in Iran, during the war especially, they really did not have, I mean, they were struggling to have access to the internet. So this asymmetry also affects, and I think for us here in what Valerie was mentioning earlier, that we already have challenges, and these challenges are big. It's not something that is easy, even for the U.S., a country that is accredited with probably creating the internet at some point, or maybe the UK. But the U.S. has the biggest tech companies today. Imagine what kind of challenges we have here, or we would have here in the next round of conflicts that we might have. I mean, the current conflict is not over officially yet. So, I think the asymmetry is not only in terms of what each country or countries have in terms of offensive, but also defensive, as well as the governance side. And I don't see how the U.S. can reconcile this, but I could see how countries here can scale up their effort and also where they should invest, not only in the offensive side, but also in terms of defensive and governance aspects of controlling information or it's regulating information, and part of which is the AI.
Thank you so much. Well, influence in the age of AI is being shaped by fast-moving, emotionally driven, and highly shareable digital content that's blurring the line between fact, propaganda, and entertainment. Our panelists have touched on the various challenges that complicate adjusting and adapting to this climate, but there are, of course, opportunities to enhance response mechanisms. And with that, I thank you both. I thank Mahsa as well, who's unfortunately not with us, but Valerie, Muhannad, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for taking part in this discussion, and thank you to you for tuning in.